use. In fact, they hardly ever use them in most of the cases, because when they encounter ordinary problems, and when they encounter extraordinary problems, it is personal initiative and imagination and judgment that they use. The rules are there, but they do not determine what exactly the practitioners will do, because the rules have the following feature. The factual predicate originates from the past, if X, which means that in the past we have noticed certain patterns, and we have codified them, and we want to carry them forward to the future. But the future is open-ended, and it is an open-ended context, which we cannot know in advance. Hence, human initiative is always required. Human improvisation will always be there for an organized action to be possible. Secondly, it is about tacit justification. The justification underlying a particular rule cannot take the form of a rule. So, as I said, for Xerox to issue those canonical rules, then these are underlain by a certain tacit justification. This is the most efficient, best way to serve the customer. But this cannot be in itself be made a rule. For the reason, I think, if I remember correctly, Bruno mentioned yesterday, quoting Wittgenstein, that rules cannot be applied by rules. Rules are applied by human beings who need to interpret them in particular contexts. And thirdly, there is consistency and non-contradiction. Remember that these rules, they tend to be, this was, I think, mentioned for the first time by Bateson. Bateson noticed that statements of the type, if X then Y, they have, some of these statements contain time, but some of these statements do not contain time. So, for example, if you say in Euclidean geometry, if we take Euclid's axioms, then we can safely assume that the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees. But if you take another statement, if the water temperature drops below 0, then the water freezes. The last statement contains time. The first statement does not contain time. So when time is absent from those statements, contradictions and paradoxes are created. And we know this intuitively, we understand this. If any human activity is managed purely on the basis of abstractions and rules, it is bound to be led to contradictions and paradoxes. I can expand on this with examples later if you want. The second component is that of practice. As I said, abstractions are important to have in order to organize a human activity, but it's not the end of the story. The second component is practices. Practices do not identify what we may call formal organizations. When we enter an organization, we enter particular human practices, collectivities with their own norms, which are distinct from formal organizations. So practice, typically, it is about a cooperative human effort involving others. It is an articulated human activity, and it is already constituted by certain distinctions into which newcomers enter, which they've got to learn and socialize and internalize, so that they can be competent members of the practice. So, and I draw on McIntyre here, practice consists of internal goods. When you are practicing medicine, teaching, any kind of job, any kind of profession, there are some internal goods one realizes through the practice, which cannot be realized in any other way but through participating in the practice itself. And secondly, in realizing those internal goods, practitioners also are driven by certain standards of excellence, which they try to instantiate in what they do. I think academic work would be an ideal example of this. There are academic practices into which we enter, which are distinct from the university representations which are also present. But in these particular practices, we are socialized when we enter them, and then we, in communities, in those practices, we strive to follow, to realize those internal goods, and in doing so, to adhere to certain standards of excellence that are operative in a particular practice. So in this sense, I think the practices are broader than organizations. They are more kind of broader collectivities. They do not have necessarily those formal organizational features, such as representations. And the kind of knowledge that is involved in there typically is inarticulate knowledge. When we enter a practice, we're initiated into the evaluative distinctions that constitute the practice. So, for example, when you, when we mark our students' scripts, for example, then that marking is grading a student's report, for example. It is a particular practice, which, when we record grades, it is a moment of that practice, and the particular activities we do are just the instantiation, the material instantiation of those activities. And you know, and I'm sure as academics we all know, that in different institutions there are different marking practices. There are different understandings of what it is a good essay, what it is to be to do good work, and marking can also differ across institutions. I think if we focus on practices, we also can account for something that Jim and Elizabeth have often mentioned, the multiplicity that we see in organizations. Organization is about homogenization, as I mentioned earlier, through its representations and abstractions, but at the same time, organization contains plurality, and the plurality, I would argue to a large extent, comes from these diverse practices that exist within the organization. And the third ontological component, sorry, I should have said, by the way, that in my first component, organization as a representation, the emphasis is on decontextualization. When you abstract something, when you represent something, you want to make it generic and applicable across contexts. Context is a problem for organization as representation. Now, for organization as practice, context is everything, because it is particular contexts within which we are initiated and whose distinctions we learn when we enter these human communities. And also, thirdly, from the point of view of action or interaction, then context again becomes important in the sense of recontextualizing. So when you are a repair technician, for example, you enter different contexts all the time, or most of the time, or often, and then you've got to recontextualize both the professional norms of your practice as well as the abstract representations of your organization. So the ability to recontextualize is important. The context reappears when we take action. So here is about situated action in the interaction order, Goffman's interaction order. In the interaction order, our activities are inescapably local. Our action is situated, and we've got and we have this, and we must sort of apply the generic abstractions and also the normative practices into particular contexts in real time. That's why recontextualization here becomes important. And a lot of this has to do with improvisation, something which we have known for at least 2,000 years since Aristotle, with phronesis. Practical wisdom, phronesis, is precisely the ability to take generic concepts and apply them in concreto, in specific circumstances. And a lot of improvisation is always there, something which ethnomethodologists have very often brought out. That when we observe human effort, there's always instances of improvisation there. And any organization, we have seen this in this conference as well. An act of improvisation was Francois announcing some changes in the program. But there's a lot of other improvisations constantly taking place to accommodate situatedness. So the organization must include this as well. The kind of, when we interact with others, typically we also interlock our behaviors, more or less. This is something which can vary. And the kind of knowledge that we use typically is narrative knowledge. So narrativity, again, a theme in Jim's work, narrativity is important here because narratives not only communicate collective knowledge within the practice, but also because they convey the departures from the canonical. A narrative it is about something extraordinary, different, something when our expectations are thwarted, and then we put them and we construct narratives to pass on.